Medicine, we or something is starting to be talked about more, which is cultural competency, because medicine has a huge social aspect to things, and social language being a part of it, and upbringings, traditions, values, beliefs, being aware culturally of all of these different things and how people view the world differently, plays a huge part into their own care. And so by growing up in these international environments, meeting people from all around the world, eating their foods, learning how to, say hello, thank you, goodbye in many different languages, and just being exposed to all of these things put me, basically, I hit the ground running in terms of being able to navigate these sometimes difficult social situations.
Welcome to the 71st episode of Tokyo Alumni Podcast. Today, our guest is a Canadian national who is ethnically Norwegian and Chinese, who was born and raised in Tokyo. He attended the now closed Santa Maria International School, later transferring and graduating from St. Mary's International School as valedictorian for the class of 2006. He earned an honors degree in microbiology and immunology from McGill University and completed medical school at the University of Manitoba. He completed a residency in ophthalmology at Dalhousie University and finished a fellowship in pediatric ophthalmology at Boston Children's Hospital at Harvard Medical School. He was the clinical director of the Special Olympics Canada Opening Eyes eye screening program for Atlantic Canada. He has worked as a professional narrator and voice actor to authoring scientific papers, as well as being a published poet and writer. He will be moving to Vancouver this winter to work for the BC Children's Hospital as a pediatric ophthalmologist and work as a clinical instructor at the University of British Columbia. Welcome to the podcast, Harald.
Thank you very much. Really happy to be here.
So it's great to have you on at last. Wanted to have you on for a while now. Episode 71. We got you. And I know I just sort of introduced, your bio, but maybe in your own words, can you just tell us like in about a minute, what you do and who you are?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Harald Gjerde, and I was born and raised here in Tokyo, and I attended Santa Maria and then finished at St. Mary's. And those years at those two international schools were, well, because they were my formative years, probably some of the best years of my life too. I made some long-lasting friendships, and I took advantage of all the activities and opportunities that they had to offer. My parents kind of wanted me to go to Canada to get an education because it was cheaper than the US. So went to McGill, did a science degree there. I actually took a gap year in between undergrad and med school. I worked at an elementary school for a year while also doing some cancer research. Applied for medical school, got into University of Manitoba, which is in central Canada. I initially wanted to be a pediatrician. I did summer school at St. Mary's and Ekeng during the summers, and so I loved working with kids. But they say that sick kids are very different than healthy kids. So I kind of, wanted to see what that was like in medical school, and I still loved it. So initially I wanted to be a pediatrician, but then I found ophthalmology, or discovered it, I guess, sometime middle of med school. And I really like the detail-oriented surgery. The eyes are very complex. We take sight for granted. So I got into ophthalmology. I decided to go that way and become a surgeon, but I still missed working with kids. And so I decided to subspecialize in pediatric ophthalmology and work with baby eyes and kids' eyes. And so I just finished my fellowship literally like June 30th.
Wow.
So yeah, a couple weeks ago. And on a whim, I decided to come back to Tokyo. I hadn't been back in almost 2 years. So wanted to see my family and meet up with friends after I finished quarantine here. Yeah, so I'm right now at my parents' place where I grew up, 5th floor of an apartment building. And yeah, it's been nice to be home.
Your interest in pediatrics, becoming a doctor, was that something existed from the time you were at St. Mary's?
No, I didn't know I wanted to be a doctor probably until university. I knew in St. Mary's, I was one of the first people because we did the IB program at St. Mary's. And so I was one of the first people to take all three basic sciences, so bio, chem, and physics. And I was able to kind of make that schedule work because I wanted to do something in the sciences. I just didn't know what. I wasn't a big fan of physics, but I knew physics was important, so that's why I forced myself to take it. But my true interests were biochem, really, a combination of biology and chemistry. And so I applied when I got into university. I knew I wanted to do something in the biological sciences, and initially chose my major to be biochemistry. But then microbiology and immunology it felt a little more clinical to me, and maybe a little more applicable in a human context, whereas biochem was much more like, wet lab, kind of dealing with reagents and such. Obviously, I'm making it very, very simplistic here, but wanting to do something more clinical piqued my interest into more of a medical path, and it kind of just I fell into it, really, because at McGill, a lot of people from around the world come, and especially in the biological sciences, it has a very good medical school itself. Our biology professor asked the first year biology class, it's about 800 people in this massive lecture hall, and they're like, "Who wants to do medicine?" And like 2/3 of the class raised their hand, and then he laid down a hardcore truth bomb, being like, 1 in 3 of you will get in.
Yeah.
And so that kind of I started to go onto that path, and I just never really looked back. To be honest, unfortunately, because once you get on a path, you start to you don't realize what else is out there. And maybe that's a function of the school environment and your peers as well. But I mean, I didn't know certain things were viable options, like say optometry, or I knew pharmacists exist, but I didn't know what their scope was. They have so much broader scope than I ever imagined when I was that age. Respiratory therapists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, anesthesia assistants, like all of these careers that I had maybe heard of. And then I never really knew what they were until I got into medical school and worked with these people. It just goes, I try to keep all options open as much as possible now. And that way I have I can make the best decision for me.
When it comes to, your field of, I guess we could say medicine in general, to what degree did, growing up overseas and being bicultural, to a certain degree bilingual, help with that process? Because I think that crossover is far more sort of salient and measurable in the world of business. But I'm wondering, in the world of medicine, how did that contribute, if at all?
So I would say a huge amount. In medicine, or something is starting to be talked about more, which is cultural competency, because medicine has a huge social aspect to things. And social language being a part of it, and upbringings, traditions, values, beliefs, being aware culturally of all of these different things and how people view the world differently, plays a huge part into their own care. And so by growing up in these international environments, meeting people from all around the world, eating their foods, learning how to, say hello, thank you, goodbye in many different languages, and just being exposed to all of these things I hit the ground running in terms of being able to navigate these sometimes difficult social situations. Yeah, I speak Japanese and English fluently. I speak a little bit of French, and any Cantonese I know from my mom's side is food related.
Mm.
And those are basically the languages I speak. But I know how to say, I know how to count to 10 in like 10 more languages. I know how to say hello, thank you. And I've learned that through the years just by interacting with people. And once they see you try, or at least then there's a more of a human connection. And then they kind of think that you care. And I do care. I'm not trying to just act, but just that going to Santa Maria and then going to St. Mary's and then even McGill to a certain extent, because 25% of the McGill population was international students. You by seeing all these people and interacting with them, it's a huge solid foundation for understanding the rest of the world. And sure, there's a lot I don't know. But that willingness, because I was exposed, that willingness to learn, and maybe not making as many cultural faux pas as maybe, someone who grew up in rural wherever. International school was by far, I think, one of the most solid things that, for my upbringing, it definitely crossed over into medicine.
So you mentioned the cultural competency aspect. How about when it comes to linguistic, I guess, uses? Are there any times that you need to read or write in a language that's not English?
So no, because learning a language is it's a whole different process than delivering healthcare. I think not everyone can learn a language easily, and everyone, if they can, takes different or do it at different paces, right? And so they can't expect somebody to just like, oh, here, you're going to be working in this area, learn the language and go. Maybe if all of your patients are only speaking that language and you don't speak it, then there's a question of why are you working there? But so let's say, for example, in Canada, some of the patients were very French speaking, especially in certain regions. And then in the US, when I moved there for my fellowship, a lot of patients were Spanish speaking. And I mean, my French is so broken and my Spanish is like just a few words here and there to get by. Definitely not at the level where I can deliver healthcare and deliver medicine. We use translators, either in-person. My favorite is in-person translators because there's, again, that human connection. They're right there, and it becomes a conversation, right? My next and probably the most commonly used one, at least at Boston Children's, was a translator iPad. There's all these different languages that you can choose from, and then on the screen there will be a actual live person where you can do a three-way communication. Yeah, sure, you have to have a valid internet connection, but other than that, it worked really well. As well as within the limitations of your resources and people and manpower, essentially. I really like to throw in a few words of whatever language that person speaks if they don't speak English, because, like I said, it gives you that connection. But sometimes when you're in a rushed, busy clinic and you're already behind, an hour and a half, and there's angry people waiting in the waiting room, you're trying to do your best, and you can't sometimes afford these pleasantries. So using the translator services helps really well.
I wasn't aware of that system. I imagine, though, it probably requires it's probably quite expensive. So you'd have to be a part of an organization, hospital that has those resources.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you have this, and it's a common question that comes up, I think, with a lot of people who are sort of torn between going to Canada or the US. You earlier mentioned, as a Canadian national, especially, it's kind of even more so now an obvious choice, at least financially, to go to Canada. I mean, a good Canadian school is, a third probably right now. It's probably about half when we were in college.
Yeah.
Now it's probably down to about a third. Not that the Canadian schools are getting cheaper, it's just the US schools are getting more expensive at a fast rate. So when it comes to crossing that border in regards to medicine, what is that process like in regards to like licensing and whatnot? Because I found that very interesting about your background. It was Canada for college, your medical school, but then you also did a little bit of time at Harvard. So how did that program work?
Yeah. So when you cross countries, no matter what country the borders you cross, you have to obey their laws and their licensing processes. Even though Canada and the US probably have the most reciprocity between the two countries in terms of training, because the border is so long and there's so many shared interests and one of the biggest trade partnerships in the world. There's a lot of cross-border communication and a lot of cross-border work. Tons of doctors from Canada go to the US to work, and quite a few doctors from the US go to Canada to work, especially along the border communities. Now, for me, at least speaking Canada and the US, the medical schools and the residency programs in both countries are accredited by essentially the same organization. And so your degrees are recognized automatically in either country. Where it becomes, where I have to do extra steps is the actual getting the medical license to practice. So I knew early on that like I said, I wanted all my options open. And so when it was in medical school, I knew I wanted to keep the option of possibly training and even more so possibly working in the US as an option. So I started to take my licensing exams essentially at the same time that I was taking my Canadian ones. The material is the same. Like you're not like, I don't have to study necessarily just for this one exam and then study again for this another one. The material is exactly the same, but and by doing that allowed me to then apply for more fellowships in the US. And other than that, actually getting the license wasn't too bad. Then of course there's the visa issues of like immigration and stuff, because that's a whole separate thing because they're two different countries. So
I imagine, there's, especially as you mentioned, places that would border Canada, like Seattle, obviously Vancouver. So is that pretty common practice with someone studying medicine to just study for both tests and knock them out both at the same time?
More common in Canada than it is, I think, in the US. I think just because I think historically the US has 10 times the amount of medical schools than Canada. And that is a factor of population, because as a crude estimate, you can say that the US has 10 times the population of Canada in general. So proportionally, it works out. But because there's just so much more people and usually more opportunities in the US, then Canadians at least want to have that option, and they tend to do that. The Americans, they tend to be much more like, I'm going to stay in America, and they tend to kind of just stay. But but in a place like you mentioned Seattle and Vancouver, I would say, well, Seattle and Vancouver is still like 2.5 hours driving distance from each other. What's much more close and much more of a reciprocal relationship is Detroit-Windsor. It's literally like a bridge across, right? And so there's American doctors who work in Windsor, and there's Canadian doctors who work in Detroit, and then there's some who travel.
That's interesting. So you'd say the crossover from Canada to the US is more prevalent than the other way around.
I would say so.
Yeah. And you're saying basically people can get the license from both countries, but then to actually work in the States, that whole process is just pretty much contingent upon one's visa, and whether or not.
And it's the same in Canada too. If an American doctor wanted to work in Canada, they'd have to follow the Canadian licensing and getting a work visa, and et cetera, et cetera. So same thing, same process, two different systems, and then talking about two different systems, then there's the whole American healthcare system versus the Canadian healthcare system, and that's like a whole separate discussion, and you can there's like university courses on the differences.
And I'm sure there's a lot of people that is in the international community, especially like non-American Canadians, like Japanese nationals who aren't sure if they want to study in Canada or the US. So
Yeah.
is the breakdown in regards to the years you need to study? I think in the States it's 4 years for your undergrad, and then you got to do your med school, and then you have to do residency. Is it very similar in Canada in regards to the years required?
Yeah. So other than so Canada, the US, and maybe one or two other countries in the world, you have to do a bachelor degree first before getting into medical school. The entire rest of the world, you get into medical school out of high school. Like in Japan, for example, I think it's 6 years of medical school, but you get in after you write your sentashken out of high school. It's a longer, it's 6 years rather than 4-year bachelor and 4-year medical school. But then you become a physician, and then you kind of go into residency, etc. But Canada and the US are very similar in that way, where you do a bachelor degree first, then you go into medical school, then you go into your residency, and then if you want to subspecialize further, you can do fellowships.
So it is the Tokyo Alumni podcast. I want to talk a little bit about Santa Maria and St. Mary's. You mentioned earlier, sort of the cultural competency. It really contributed towards having a global mindset.
Yeah.
During your time at St. Mary's, what still remains with you the most? I mean, apart from the whole, being a global citizen and being culturally competent.
The people that I feel most comfortable being around in general are my classmates from St. Mary's. And maybe it's just a function and the time period of like, it's your formative years. You're just, figuring out who you are and what your place is in the world. You're growing up together. You're doing all these activities, sports and fine arts all together. And it just that cohesiveness, that environment is what it's hard to put into words, but it's what I take most, or it's what I remember most from it. And just my interactions with people as I did these activities and went through school. And
you have this unique background of being, ethnically Norwegian, Chinese, but raised in Japan. Would you say, in a sense, maybe like St. Mary's is kind of like your home, as opposed to Japan
for sure
being your home?
Yeah, I mean, I don't look Japanese. I look like I'm half Asian, half white. Everyone thinks I'm half Japanese because I speak Japanese and I grew up here. And to be honest, at heart, I'm more Japanese than anything. But because I grew up in an international environment, I would say one step more is that, I'm much more of I'm an international kid more than anything. It's a unique experience. This for sure. And everyone who's been in these and who's mixed race or even not, and just grew up in these in the international school circuit, they know it's a tight-knit community. It's certain unique experiences that you can't get anywhere else around the world. And what I was saying at the beginning of being exposed to all these different cultures and ideologies, fostering an environment that globalization and just unity in general is something that needs to happen more, I think, around the world. But the breeding grounds are these international schools. International schools are still schools, so you're going to have all the same problems that other schools have, with unfortunately, like bullying, or people who have difficulty with academics, or kids doing bad things that may get them kicked out or whatever. You're going to still have these, or terrible teachers, or issues, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have all of these things. And it's the same with almost any school. The risk of it is the same. But there is still an extra flavor that international schools provide that is unique and special.
Yeah, I think that's well put. That, you know, all the problems do exist, but they have that edge that, you know, you cannot
For sure
simply purchase with money, right? It's about the student demographic that makes it special.
Yeah, it definitely is.
Well, you know, at the end here, I like to ask the guest what's coming up in their lives the next few years, next few decades. So if you could just tell us what is to come.
Sure. Decades, I have no idea, but few years. I just finished my fellowship. I now am a pediatric ophthalmologist, but it's been a long road. I like to say that I just graduated grade 26. And I haven't really had a good break. And so I've come home now to Tokyo. I'm taking actually 4 months off to be an unemployed bum, which is fantastic. And it's the first big break I've had in forever. I'll be here in Tokyo for 6-7 weeks more. And then I have to, I have to bounce around a couple places, but basically starting in November or so, I'll be moving to Vancouver. I'm going to be taking over somebody's practice there, and then working in the hospitals and operating. Because I'm taking over someone's practice, I plan to be there for at least probably 5 or more years. Working and trying to save up some money finally. After that, I don't know where the opportunities will be. It's possible I may move somewhere else, or I may make Vancouver my permanent home. Who knows? I wish Japan was much more of a viable option, because I would love to come back. But working in Japan as a physician can be quite difficult, especially with just the way you're trained, and some of the expectations can be very different. And so, I may keep up with, relationships at different hospitals, or create relationships at different hospitals so I can collaborate on clinical research things, maybe do a little bit of teaching here in Japan. But I'll be back and forth, and it will. I don't know what the future holds, but it should be exciting.
Yeah, that's God, it's daunting to think 26 years in education, but you've made it now. Huh? You're done.
But now I'm at the bottom of the totem pole, and now I have to go make my way up.
Starting over again, but definitely that's a really cool thing that you're done with all this, and now 4 months off. And I guess so back to Canada.
I left my car and all my stuff in Boston, because coming to Japan was like a very last minute decision. And so I have to go back to Boston first, get my car, get my stuff, then drive up to where all my other stuff is in Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And then actually I'm going to take October and drive across Canada as I move to Vancouver, and kind of make it a trip. So I'll take like 3 to 4 weeks to kind of just like slowly make my way across. Yeah.
So final road trip before you
exactly
officially begin. And it's been really nice talking to you. This is the end of episode 71. Thank you for being on today, Harald.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.